You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community.
Welcome to the 2016 Iowa City Book Festival, presented by the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature. We would like to thank the sponsors who made this event possible: the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa Arts Council, Sheraton Iowa City, the Iowa City Public Library, the Iowa City Coralville Convention and Visitors Bureau, and Iowa Tourism. Today, as a panel discussion on Binaries on the Run, we will hear from Mallory Hellman, Alia Adegemwe, Ko-Hwa Chen, and Alexander Maxis, who will discuss how the burgeoning sexual landscape figures in their writing. The panel is moderated by Mallory Hellman. Mallory received an MFA in fiction from the Iowa Writers Workshop and a BA in English and American Literature from Harvard. Her nonfiction has appeared in the Forbes Booked blog and in the Indiana Review, and her short story, October Forest River, was a finalist in the Room of Her Own Foundation's Orlando Prize. She has taught writing courses at Indiana University, the University of Iowa, the Duke Talent Identification Program, and elementary and secondary schools throughout eastern Iowa. She currently serves as director of the Iowa Youth Writing Project. Alia Adegemwe is a writer, artist, and educator based in Iowa City. She earned an MFA in nonfiction writing from the University of Iowa, where she is currently a doctoral student in media studies. Ko-Hwa Chen is a writer and artist from Taiwan. He is the author of more than 20 volumes of poetry. His collection, Tears of Ignorance, was recently translated into Japanese. Alexander Maxis is the author of 3 novels: You Deserve Nothing, A Marker to Measure Drift, which was named a New York Times notable book and a finalist for both the William Saroyan Prize and the Le Prix du Miller Livre Étranger, and his latest release, Shelter in Place.
Welcome, everybody, to the Binaries on the Run panel. It's fantastic to see you all here and to have such a talented and diverse group of writers here to discuss this timely topic, and one that hopefully will see some differences in the discourse going on in the United States versus Taiwan in this. I'm really, really excited to get started. So we've each prepared some remarks that'll take about 5 minutes apiece, and then we have a few questions, and we'll take some from the audience. So
I should just say that I have not prepared anything. I didn't know that was part of the panel, so I think I'll just listen to what you say and then chime in.
That's totally cool. Look at this. We're disturbing the structure of what this is supposed to be. Already we're doing revolutionary work. Not a problem at all. Aaliyah, would you like to get us started then?
I could, but I also didn't prepare anything for this panel.
Excellent.
I was told it was just going to be off the cuff.
Right,
And that,
as was I.
In terms of not being binary, that we weren't going to be stuck in this very rigid academic panel structure with
that's
paper presentations.
This is an act of protest?
This is an act of protest for sure.
We're disrupting the binary system.
Well, then let me put it to you all this way. Why this panel? Why are you here? What is your connection to this subject? And why is it important to you to speak about it today?
I'll go first, as the person directly to your left. I'm interested in this panel simply because of the corporeal shell that I live in, which kind of inherently forces me to be interested in the idea of binaries as they're socially constructed, and the ways in which they're false, and the ways that I prove that they're false, and how I can relay that information to people either through my writing or through other modes of communication that I happen to kind of take up on a regular basis, kind of as I move through the world day to day. As somebody who is studying media within the Department of Communication Studies, I'm very interested in intersectionality and thinking about how people who claim multiple marginalized identities have to navigate both their relationships within the communities that they ostensibly belong to, but also their relationships within the mainstream, or their relationships to people who exist perhaps not as, not on as many margins as they do. So in thinking about what was interesting to me for this panel, well, one, I think when I was asked to be on it, I was excited at the potential of hearing what the other panelists have to say, because they are writing in different genres and I think from very different perspectives than I am, but also I was interested in bringing that perspective, I think, to the conversation and thinking about how writing nonfiction or focusing on essays tends to be very different when you're thinking about binaries, I think, than if you're writing fiction or poetry in a lot of ways.
Oh, Chen, I know you prepared remarks. I saw them.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm Kwa Chen. Why I'm interested in this topic? Actually, this is the topic I usually try to avoid, because. But I think I'm new here. I usually write in Chinese, so I guess there's no many Asian writers. They try to expose their gender, sex orientation, or sex gender issues in their writing, and actually we have very strong Chinese tradition to express the same gender affair or emotion in our literature, but we don't name it. We don't have the term homosexuality. Yeah, it's just love. Or yeah. So I'm quite interested to know the people here, how they consider this topic, and also I have some story to share here. So I write it down. I'm sorry for my English. So okay. As a poet and a gay man, I start to write at the age of 16, stricken by a mysterious epiphany. I was ignorant about my homosexuality at that time. It was later I turned to medicine. In short, as a person, I realized I was born to be a poet and then a doctor. Knowing my own homosexuality did change my writing, so did become a doctor. I do not foreground my homosexuality in my poetry. Some American friends ask me questions like, are you a gay poet or a poet who happens to be gay? I always respond at once. The latter, of course. Homosexuality is only a facade of my being, not all. There was no struggle in accepting myself as a gay man. It was coming out that placed significant influence on my writing. Coming out seems to free me from the mentality of eagerly craving for recognition. After that, I resumed to be me, to observe, to feel, to choosefully express. No need to attract attention. Nor to shout at the top of my throat. I have always covered a wide range of subjects, but there were some very old sore spots which I felt open to trade it upon only after I came out, such as my friend's death from AIDS and the tension between me and my family. Taiwan may be the first country that legalized gay marriage in Asia. And its achievement may be proud about. However, there are many problems and barriers there. In my opinion, the weakness of Taiwan's gay movement is that it did not started from the the body, but from a highly politicalized position, strategically allied with feminism movement. After long politically correct years, queer study has become one of the mainstreams in academia. All kinds of terminology became popular, and everybody was gay-friendly and supportively orally. But as if there was no other way to show their superiority in thought, open-mindedness, and they are on the front edge of the time. Honestly, I seriously doubt how fairly the diversification can withstand any challenge. A Japanese scholar questioned with such a abundant output of queer situation. Discourse and the largest gay pride. Situation where there's huge queer discourse. The Japanese scholar questioned that such an abundant output of queer discourse and the largest gay pride in Asia, how come there is almost no gay porn industry in Taiwan? Yeah, and in Japan, it is the exact opposite situation where there's only few queer discourse, but the world largest and almost most excellent gay pornography. So, yeah. So this question burst the balloon of Taiwan gay movement, exposing its blind spot and illusion. There is a joke in Taiwan goes like this: a father may claim he has no problem with gays, but if his son comes out to him, he will break his legs. So in foreseeable future, Taiwan will pass a gay marriage law, and presently gay couples can register their relationship at the related government unit. However, the strongest opposition comes from the right-wing churches, such as, I can even pronounce the name, Presbyterian Church, Spiritual Grace Presbyterian Church, and the Bread of Life Christian Church. These bodies propagated the law-making process by supporting certain lawmakers in legislature to achieve their agenda, and they are to ignore. To sum up, there is still much to do for gay rights in Taiwan. Yeah, thank you.
I'm here, I think, because my novel is a story of a bipolar man whose mother comes to the defense of a woman who's being beaten in the parking lot of a hardware store in Seattle, and she hits him with a hammer, and then continues to hit him and goes to prison for murder, and becomes a kind of feminist heroine. And the idea of the novel from the beginning was to subvert in some way these traditional gender roles that are so commonly ascribed to men and women. The men in the novel are they have characteristics that are traditionally ascribed to women and vice versa. So from the beginning, I imagined that my narrator, a man named Joey March, was a kind of princess in her tower, and the love of his life has abandoned him, and she is out playing essentially the errant knight. And the idea of the book really began there. And I very much was interested in the idea of a man in waiting who is stuck at home wondering where his brave knight has gone. And very, very briefly, that is a sort of, conceptually anyway, the beginning of the book. And so Tess Wolfe, who is the love of Joey March's life, is unapologetically absent and behaves in the ways that we so often see, particularly in film and television and in fiction as well. She behaves in the ways that we so often see the brave cowboy, the mysterious cop, and so on. So that's generally the idea. That's where the novel began. So there you have it. This is sort of like waking up in the middle of a nightmare, in the sense that you arrive in a public forum and someone introduces you by saying, "Comments have been prepared. Go ahead." I mean, at least I'm wearing clothes. So I apologize. I apologize for not being better prepared.
Hey, it's all right. This is a conversation. We are just having a conversation.
All the better.
The extent of my preparation was while I was getting ready this morning. I was thinking of these sentences, so we're just about at the same place. You heard it here first. Japan is the place to go for the world's best gay porn. Write it down. So my purchase on this topic, I'm a fiction writer, and I started writing fiction seriously when I was in college. And when I did that, I had the struggle that almost every other queer person I know who has taken up writing has. Will we be queer writers, or will we be writers who happen to be queer? Mm-hmm. And I decided that I absolutely did not want to be a queer writer. I did not want to be pigeonholed into that universe where my books would only be sold in the gay and lesbian section of the bookstore. The only award I would be eligible for would be a Lambda. And, I mean, if I dared to write a character who was demographically similar to me and queer, everybody would think it was about me. Nobody wants to fall into that hole. So I went as far away from that as I possibly could, and for years, I only wrote straight cis male protagonists. I wrote usually from the perspective of lovelorn divorced fathers in their middle age, so people I could relate to very well from personal experience, not at all. But I figured, they like women, I like women, what could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, there are quite a lot of stories about cis white men and their struggles. And I was not contributing meaningfully to that conversation at all. Mm-hmm. And as I was starting to get closer to applying to MFA programs, a good friend of mine suggested that I try writing a queer female character, somebody whose background was a little more like mine. And still gun-shy about coming too close to autobiography, I looked to the mainstream canon for advice. I looked to the way that books had portrayed women like me, and I wrote a character who fit that description. She grew up in really negative circumstances. She was disowned by her family. She was scrappy, she was tough, and she met a bad end. And she was also a secondary character, which is important. She wasn't a protagonist. And I think that there's something to be said for the fact that as of 2009, 2010, when I was working on these drafts, that was the kind of reflection of myself I saw in literature. And I started to get a little frustrated with that. And so when I started my MFA, I was thinking, forget worrying about my characters' demographics before I worry about who they are as people. I'm just going to get to know them and not worry about their gender. And so I started writing this character who I really liked as I got to know more and more. And it became evident to me that this character was trans, that was the thing that they were not telling me for a little while, but it became evident that this person was a trans man. And of course, I had the panic immediately of how can I, as somebody who identifies as mostly cisgender, write a trans character faithfully? It's a problem of representation. I didn't worry about representation when I was writing about men because there's a whole wide world of literature about men. I didn't worry about representation when I was writing my, cis straight women because there's a whole world of representation out there. But how could I, somebody who's not trans, adequately represent a trans person? And the first place I went, I'm fortunate to have a lot of trans and gender nonconforming friends, but I didn't stop there. I went to trans health clinics throughout the Northeast, which is where my book is set. I watched countless YouTube videos about how to inject testosterone and voice changes, and started writing this character and realized that I had written a really, really medicalized person. Someone who was constantly injecting things and thinking about body parts and was kind of reduced. And so I went back and started writing scenes from this person's adolescence because writing a queer adolescence came as second nature to me. That was finally like kicking it in and doing the thing I wanted to do. So I wrote his adolescence, and that part of the book is now finished, but the part in contemporary times when, he's 25 and trying to figure himself out is still very much a work in progress because I'm still trying to figure out how I can, if I can, write somebody who is both not in my gender identity and in, such a minority position and one that's being so scrutinized right now. So that's my interest in this conversation.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Not to take your moderator.
Please do.
But thinking about something that you said earlier about wanting to shy away from writing characters when you first started writing that could be read as autobiographical, wanting to kind of stay away from that. What do you think? I mean, I feel like I know what the answer to that question is, but it's I feel like there's an undue burden on people who already exist on the margins to stay away from, the even barest tinge of autobiography in fiction, even though I feel like there's a lot of autobiographical fiction that exists in the world that is written by men. And I wonder if that's something that even though you're kind of in the depths of this project right now, if that's something that you feel like you might be able to do as you move through this process, either in short stories or in the novel, where you might be able to write a character who maybe on the surface appears more like you.
Maybe. I don't know. With this novel, I've kind of broken ground with that. The person grew up in Florida, which was a big access point for me.
I grew up in Florida, too.
Weird. Where?
No, Orlando.
Ooh.
Ooh.
Yeah. Quick question. Is your family okay?
Yeah, they're fine.
Okay. Yeah, no, I grew up in South Florida, and so did this character. And one of the things about Florida, and you can back me up on this, is that it's a place where, at least in my portion of Florida, gender and sexual orientation were very, for a community that called itself liberal, things were pretty rigid there. And I wasn't out when I was growing up, and neither was my character. And so maybe that's why the scenes of this person's adolescence were so easy for me to write. A closeted person growing up in Florida, just trying to find their way in the world, before he came to the understanding that he was trans. But yeah, as a nonfiction writer, I mean, how does it feel to be explicit about that and not have people ask, is this you, but say, okay, this is you?
It's really weird. Depending on how one counts, I've been working on my first book for either 7 or 10 years, and I think it's so difficult because it feels very complicated, very dangerous, very personal, particularly because I'm writing about femininity, I'm writing about sexuality, I'm writing about sexual violence, and, weaving in opinions about pop culture and the media as well. And that, I think, particularly in this time and place where, as Roxane Gay said earlier this week, if you're a Black writer who expresses an opinion on the internet, it's like people want to kill you or threaten you or find out where you live. And it can be very, very traumatic, I think, to see that happen to other people and want to finish this larger project, but also feel like not having that type of visibility is really nice, And so as I get to the end of this manuscript, it's definitely kind of a struggle to try and figure out how to deal with the kind of fear and anxiety that just naturally comes with working on a first book that I think everybody can relate to, but also the fear and anxiety that comes with existing in this particular sociocultural situation where people want to fucking grab you by the pussy.
It's all good.
Sorry if cursing is not allowed on TV. Maybe you can bleep it. But it's definitely like really nerve-wracking. But I also feel like it's important, or I wouldn't be doing it. I wouldn't be working on this book. I wouldn't be writing this essays if I didn't feel like it was important for Black women to speak for themselves, especially if they're articulating a subjectivity that's not considered normative or mainstream in some way. I don't know, just to kind of add to the variety of types of representation that exist, I think, in the public sphere, so that people can get out of like this very, very, very old, very kind of trenchant binary that exists about who exactly Black women can be in the United States in the 21st century.
Absolutely. To what extent does autobiography or do autobiographical facts play into your fiction, your poetry?
My first novel, it played quite heavily. The second, not at all. And this last, I know a fair bit about mental illness, and a lot of that knowledge goes into the book. I mean, in terms of plot, my mother happily is not in prison. On the other hand, my mother is a fierce, independent, highly intelligent, tough woman. And knowing her and growing up with her, and frankly, knowing other women like that, it profoundly informed the writing of this book. I think it's impossible really to write anything that isn't in some way autobiographical. That's hardly a revelation. And yet you would think that it is a revelation given the way that people write about art these days. So to answer your question, my experience is in everything I write. The more I write, the further I try to get from my own immediate experience. And as a result, I think the more I write, the more personal my work becomes. I feel far more vulnerable having published this book than I did with my first, which might surprise somebody. But I think, I feel very, very strongly about the importance of making your work, one's work, personal. This separation, and I mean that as in a kind of emotional way. I do believe that we should write everything we are interested in, but I also understand that is an attitude of certain privilege. Nonetheless, I would like to continue being more ambitious in my work than less.
Something really interesting is when I start to write poems, I was 16, and as you know, in Chinese, there's no gender in a traditional way, and it's last century we create new words for she or he or you. There's a male you and a female you, but I is no gender. But it's something interesting is when I began to write, I always use the words with no gender. And then when I confuse with my sexual orientation, I began to use the words with female gender. And then I get to medical college, and gradually I realize, and I be sure of my identity, and I change it to the words with male gender, and then that's it in presentative of everybody. So that's very interesting change that, and but after I come out, and I wrote a column for newspaper about all the gay story, and I published that. But I like to share a story about my experience. May I read my story? It's quite short. My coming out day. Early one Sunday morning in June of 2004, when I happened to sit by my desk, the phone rang. It must be from my colleague of the hospital, I thought. Who could call anyone else in such personal hours? As a doctor, call at these early hours often means emergency in hospital. It's Dr. Chen, said the caller. Though surprised to hear a total stranger in this hour on phone, I respond, yes, automatically. The man paused a little, not expecting my directness, perhaps reconfirmed my identity. I cut right to the chest. He is speaking. What's the matter? What followed was a 2-week scenario of blackmailing force that filled up the society pages in the newspaper. The moment that my identity was fully confirmed, the man spoke in a totally different tone, turning into a Taiwanese gangster using Mandarin with a Taiwanese accent, which was typically in the underworld of Taiwan, claiming that he was a member of Bamboo Union gang, which probably was the one most thought about where gangs were concerned. What was alarming was that he threatened to expose my homosexuality in the hospital unless I pay him $1 million. And while woven firm by the ridiculousness, in yet I was caught between the tears and laughter. Haven't I come out already? Having published so profusely on gay issue and for gay people, everybody who's anybody at or in literary circle and in my hospital knew I'm gay. And now someone was blackmailing me for being gay. It seems preposterous to ask this blackmailer to check my publication. It was heart-wrenching to realize that all the effort invested into publishing articles and works on the subject might just have been totally in vain. All the points and columns supporting gay rights, some in very strong language, was suddenly annihilated, wiped out of every list, and the last trace, as if nothing at all has been said. I shivered at the thought, or was it that I haven't been radical enough? Right after he hung up, I called my police officer friend, and it's a patient of mine. In 2 weeks and a day, the case was closed. A policeman pretending to be my boyfriend and negotiated with with him and settled the amount of money and the way to pick it up. He showed up and caught red-handed by the ambushing police. It turned out gangster, and he said he was a college lecturer. Yet the story was far from end. What is next was much juicier. as it was a case of public prosecution case. 1.5 years passed before the prosecutor advanced the indictment. The bloodthirsty reporter that regularly squatted outside the courthouse like flies were for and the vultures for anything juicy spotted this and called me, what should we write about this? We are on your side. Don't worry. We will report that you are not gay at all. What the hell? I could not utter one single sound, thinking, have I come out already? How many times in my life do I have to come out? Is there any other way to coming out than telling those total strange reporters, yes, I'm gay? They didn't even interview in person anymore. The next day, as my blackmail case have occupied the top of the society pages of the newspaper, and the 24-hour TV news ran my incident hourly all day. Many of my gay friends called to offer comfort. Only till now did I know that some of them has gone through the shit already, and that they choose to pay to keep the blackmailer silent. I was completely speechless. I might not be the first gay to be blackmailed, but definitely the first to call the police. As a gay man, one can choose to hide in the closet for life, or one can choose to seek adulterous relationships under the cover of straight marriage, while some screaming loud and clear and fearlessly about their homosexuality. The point is that choice is out of personal will. If anyone tries to place even the slightest pressure on others is to make this decision, it is violence. It's come to me that when I studied in Harvard Medical School, there was an activity called Out Day. 2 weeks ahead, its promotion poster and emails went everywhere. Please come out to 6 of the people close to you on Out Day. I remember I protested to a reporter that your media deprived me from my human right of coming out in free will. Years later, in Taipei International Poetry Festival, I met a Hong Kongese poet, Yu Jing, an out lesbian poet, and she told me, once you came out, you will repeat the coming out forever. Ironically, people love to stuff you back into the closet and enjoy watching coming out again and again. I hope today would be the last time I say, yes, I'm gay.
Thank you. Tension I've seen emerge over everybody's comments so far is that when somebody of a minority group, any minority group, regardless of how visible that is, and regardless of how many minority groups they represent, decides to become a writer, we have this question upon us, this onus, this will I shout? Will I be loud? Do I have an obligation to fairly and accurately represent the people I stand for? Or is literature literature? Is it a space where we should be able to not have to shill for what we are and represent what we are? And so I'm curious as to how you all feel as authors and as minority authors. Is it our obligation to represent or not? To what extent is it?
I think I'll sit this one out.
Yeah. Minority, however you construe it.
true. I feel like I mean, as an essayist, I feel like I can't help but have to represent the communities that I come from and who I am. But at the same time, with the understanding that I can only actually speak for myself. And I think that's perhaps why I'm interested in kind of the autoethnographic essay, but also thinking about how to connect this relaying of personal experience to thinking about media more broadly, to thinking about how critical theory can be made more accessible as a way for people to think about how to contextualize their personal experience. And so in doing that, something that I always feel like I articulate, especially throughout this longer project, is that, yes, I'm a member of these communities by virtue of my existing in this corporeal shell, but at the same time, I'm only ever speaking for myself and providing one example for what someone who embodies these particular identities can do or say or think or be in the world. And so it's like, as like a queer identified woman of perceivable African descent, it's like the assumptions, I think, surrounding me because of my gender presentation, which is typically kind of feminine of center, because of my perceived racial or ethnic identity, because of my perceived, place of origin. It's like all of those narratives that kind of exist simply because of what people think when they see me. I feel like I have a duty to, in my work, dispel those myths. At the same time, I think that unquestionably the goal for me is to create work that's beautiful and make literature. And I feel like one can split the baby, You can do both if you want to. But that it depends on what you want, really.
Absolutely. So we have time for questions from the audience, and I'll ask, if you ask a question, please come up and use that microphone, strange and potentially uncomfortable as it may be, because we are on TV, and you will not be heard if you do not use the microphone.
The nightmare intensifies.
Oh, yeah.
Please approach the microphone.
That was so like city council.
Well, isn't that where we are?
Council,
Yeah.
literally. Right. I don't even know.
Yes, it's on Iowa Public Television.
Well, being an Iowan and 71 years old, how do you guys?
So I think the mic is not on.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how to turn anything on.
Nor did I.
Okay. Can't hear you anyway, so. As an Iowan, and I'm 71 years old, I don't know how you approach the historical fiction of being gay in Midwest Iowa. You're in Iowa right now, and, at one time they were killing gay people. At one time, well, not very long ago, you couldn't go to Vietnam and serve in the military. So how do you approach the historical fiction of being gay or transgender? How do you approach that? Or do you guys approach historical fiction? Because you're all very young.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I heard a little inhale over there. Was anybody?
I inhaled only because, once again, I should say that I am not. I'm not a gay man, so I probably shouldn't answer this question.
I wanted to know from you, what's your name of your book with the bipolar?
Oh, it's called Shelter in Place. Yeah, sure.
I think I can answer your question maybe more broadly. part of my book is definitely set here. I've lived here for 7 years. And a lot of the thinking that I've done since I've been here, but first as an MFA student, now as a PhD student, has figured into that project. And so I can't help but think about what it's like to be a queer person here in Iowa. And because of the way that my brain works, for better or worse, often it's very distracting. I cannot help but think of the historical context surrounding the issues, the places, the people that tend to find itself into my work. And that's something that I do as an instructor as well, trying to make my students understand the fact that it's very, very, very important, maybe the most important thing to do before entering any conversation. And whether I think someone is writing fiction or poetry or nonfiction, whenever you write and publish, you are entering into, even if you don't publish, I think you're entering into a conversation. And I think having an understanding of the particular context surrounding the elements of that conversation is a very, very important thing to do.
Yeah. I think queerness has a historical heft regardless of where you are. It's an interesting thing to hold on to identify with, to become part of, whether you will it or not. And I think that really that's played as much into my life as my writing, but I think that was my central difficulty around coming out, actually, that my mother came from a historical perspective, and a perspective much more closely aligned to yours than mine. And when I came out, she thought I would get hurt. That was the big thing she was afraid of, that I would get hurt, that I would get killed, that I would go to a place like Iowa and not make it out. And what's interesting about queer history is just how many leaps we've made in like the last 10 or 15 years. I mean, I came out 15 years ago, and in the time and space between now and then, so much has changed. I can get married. I can change my pronouns legally and be okay if I wanted to do that. And when I came to the Midwest, I actually knew Iowa before anything else as a place that allowed marriage. Because we were one of the forerunners of that, it felt like a more open space to me. But I was also afraid of, encountering what my East Coast Jewish parents feared would be a town full of bigots, a city full of bigots. And it's really actually been quite pleasant to engage with the Iowa that is now, if confusing, to see how it sits on its history. Yeah. Anybody else?
I guess, let's see. You talked about coming out repeatedly, but I'm curious how you interact with social media, how your identities as queer people or not, and as writers work in this social media world that we live in.
I would prefer never to appear on social media. I find the older I get, the more distracting and destructive it is. I think it is sort of lowering my intelligence very slowly. I know there are a lot of people who disagree and see social media as a real, as a powerful tool, and I recognize that. But the only reason I use it is because my publishers have asked me to do so. I don't know whether or not it has any power, whether or not I sell books, which is really, I don't use it for any real political reasons. It seems anathema, it seems sort of antithetical to the whole project of writing well, to be writing in the space that we are allowed, using a kind of vernacular that we're expected to use while on social media. But that is probably a sort of cranky old man's attitude, but it's certainly mine.
Okay. since I'm come from Asia, I would like to say something about the situation or the traditional condition in China, and actually, as we know, many the stars in the entertainment industry, actually, a lot of them are gay or lesbian, but nobody will come out in the social media. Yeah, but I would consider that's kind of influence of the Christianity, because in the from the literature, there's a lot of the intellectual in ancient China. They praise the affair between same gender. Even in the most famous novel in China, the Hong Lou Meng, the main character Jia Baoyu, everybody know he loved the female the character Lin Daiyu. Yeah, everybody knows that. But actually, if you read the novel, he also have affairs with the other boys. Yeah, they are in the novel. They are really young. They are in teenagers, and so even another very famous novelist, Ba Jin, in last century, 1940s, he write a story about his family. He was in a school, and his father have married, so he back home to see his stepmother, and he found that actually his father married a guy. In last century, it's hard to imagine because it's a actor of Chinese opera. So in that. I mean, it seems quite. Nobody would like to mention, but actually, it's pretty common things. If you have you can get married with a woman and you have affair with a guy. That's pretty common especially in the intellectuals people, and so I just realized that actually in Asian or Chinese family, they really value the family bondage. They really want you to get married, and the thing is, if you don't have kids, if you don't breed children, or you can pass your name and to the next generation, and that's a really big problem. But really, nobody cares your sexual orientation. So from the literature as a writer, I read so many stories in ancient China, in modern China. They praise the relationship of same gender. That's totally not an issue at all. But part of the influence is to come from the Christian narrative. Yeah.
I try not to use social media that much. I use it mostly for my work with the Iowa Youth Writing Project, which is totally without sexual orientation at all. So, I mean, in my personal Facebook, I have no problems being out or advocating for queer causes, but I think that were I to use Facebook to market my writing, I would try distinctly not to put too queer of an angle on it, because I like audiences of all genders, all types. We have time for about one more question, if anybody's got one.
I know some of you said you were kind of reserved about coming out as queer writers initially because you didn't want to be put in a box, and the media does kind of put a certain slant on anybody who falls on the queer spectrum. How do you address that in your writing? Is that a clear question?
So, like, address the relationship of the media to writing and writing, or address...
Yeah, or even just the basic tropes and stereotypes that you encounter in the media.
Ooh. I think because my book is heavily influenced by media studies and kind of textual analysis at its heart, it's very much about addressing stereotypes and people attempting to construct fake categories and stick me in them. However, I feel like there's a limit to how much it seems like one can move or like push a publisher in terms of how your book is categorized. There's a really great reading tomorrow, and I forget the name of the author, but her book, Without You, There Would Be No Us, Suki Kim. Thank you. Her name is Suki Kim, and she wrote a really wonderful essay about the struggle of attempting to have her publisher market her book as a work of journalism, which it is, because she went undercover in North Korea like a boss and, under pain of who knows what, and, wanted it labeled to reflect what was actually in the text. At the same time, she had to fight this structure that wanted to market it as a memoir, because that's what ladies write. Ladies write memoirs, from their memories, as opposed to being hardcore badass embedded reporters in foreign countries that are dangerous. And so I think it's not just a struggle that queer writers have to deal with. It's also something that writers of color have to deal with, so that you're not stuck in the Latino literature section, or you're not stuck in the FM literature section, and people can look at your work in a way that, or people can get access to your work through, consumerist spaces in a way that enables them to actually see like what's in it, as opposed to however the powers that be want to label it so that they can fit you into kind of whatever neat category you want to be fit into. And so it's like long story short, reading that essay made me think that there's just no point in attempting to fight anybody ever about anything, because they're just going to label it however they see fit.
I was in a bookstore 2 days ago, and I saw Junot Diaz in the world literature section, which is...
Are you serious?
Crap.
It's mind-boggling. I mean, it goes in all directions, absolutely, that categorization, yeah.
It's really upsetting. And I think maybe that's where social media comes in, because you're able to write essays like that and disseminate them, because you're able to have the type of conversation about marketing, about categories, about exactly what's wrong with publishing that enables, I think, the wronged party to articulate what they think is wrong about that, but also to start conversations with other writers, both people who are already published and people who are somewhere within the process of writing, somewhere within the process of publishing, in hopes that maybe it can be different at some point. Though I'm a pessimist, so I don't think it'll ever be different or good ever, maybe.
On that very uplifting note, we must conclude. Thank you so much for coming to the Binaries on the Run panel. Thank you to all of our authors who spoke.